The Soviet Union had more tanks and more soldiers and more nuclear weapons than the United States for most of the Cold War, and controlled half of Europe and had an ideology that inspired revolutionary movements on every continent, and spent 40% of its national budget on military power. And yet, in 1991, the entire Soviet system collapsed without a single shot fired between American and Soviet forces. And here's what makes that outcome absolutely stunning, because in 1945, the USSR looked unstoppable with the Red Army occupying Eastern Europe and communist parties gaining strength in France and Italy, and China falling to Mao and revolutionary movements spreading through Asia and Africa, and serious analysts predicted that socialism would overtake capitalism as the dominant global system. And yet 46 years later, the Soviet Union didn't just lose the Cold War. It completely disintegrated into 15 separate countries, and its economy was in ruins, and its military was selling equipment for scrap, and its ideology was so discredited that even the Communist Party dissolved itself. And the question that historians still debate is how the United States engineered this victory without fighting a direct war. And there are 6 specific reasons that work together to systematically destroy Soviet power. And when you understand these mechanisms, you'll see that the Cold War outcome wasn't uncertain or close. It was actually inevitable from about 1970 onward, because the Americans had built a system that the Soviets literally could not counter. And the first reason is something that sounds almost too simple, but turned out to be devastatingly effective. And that's the fundamental economic model difference, where the United States had a consumer economy that generated constant innovation, while the Soviet Union had a command economy optimized for heavy industry and military production. And here's why this difference mattered more than nuclear weapons or military alliances: because consumer economies create a self-reinforcing cycle of innovation. And in America, companies competed to sell products to hundreds of millions of consumers, and this competition drove them to constantly improve quality and reduce costs and develop new technologies. And think about what this meant in practice, because American companies in the 1950s and 60s were innovating in electronics and chemicals and aerospace and computers because there were profitable civilian markets for these technologies, and IBM developed mainframe computers to sell to businesses, and Texas Instruments created transistors for consumer electronics, and Boeing built commercial aircraft for airlines. And all of these innovations had military applications, but they were funded primarily by civilian markets, and this meant that American military technology benefited from an enormous industrial base that was innovating constantly. And compare this to the Soviet system, where the economy was centrally planned and most advanced technology went directly to military applications, and there was no consumer market driving innovation because Soviet citizens had no choice in what products they bought, and factories had no incentive to improve quality or reduce costs because they were simply assigned production quotas by central planners. And this created a situation where Soviet military technology could match American capabilities in narrow areas where the government focused resources like ballistic missiles and fighter aircraft, but the broader technology base was stagnant. And here's the mechanism that made this fatal: because technology started advancing faster in the 1970s and 80s, and the innovations came from areas like microelectronics and software and material science. And these were fields where consumer markets drove development, and the Soviet Union fell further and further behind because they had no equivalent market mechanism. And by the 1980s, American weapons systems were incorporating computer technology that was generations ahead of Soviet equivalents, because American companies like Intel and Microsoft were developing chips and software for massive civilian markets, and military applications could leverage that development. And Soviet weapons designers had to work with electronics that were 10 or 15 years behind, because there was no civilian market driving advancement. And the economic data shows this clearly, because Soviet GDP growth was strong in the 1950s and 60s when they could copy Western technology and focus on heavy industry, but slowed dramatically in the 70s and essentially stopped in the 80s. And meanwhile, the American economy kept growing because the consumer sector was driving constant innovation. And the second reason is what really separated these two systems, and it's something that operated in the background but had enormous cumulative effects, and that's the alliance structure, where America built coalitions based on mutual economic benefit, while the Soviet Union maintained its bloc through military occupation and political repression. And here's why this created a decisive advantage, because American allies like West Germany and Japan and South Korea were genuinely prosperous, and their citizens enjoyed high living standards and political freedom. And this made the alliances stable and self-reinforcing, because these countries wanted to remain aligned with the United States, and their economic growth made them stronger partners who could contribute technology and resources and manufacturing capacity to the Western Bloc. And Japan became the world's second largest economy, and West Germany became an industrial powerhouse, and South Korea went from poverty to advanced economy status. And all of this strengthened the overall Western position. And compare this to the Soviet bloc, where countries like Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia were occupied by force, and their economies were subordinated to Soviet interests, and their citizens lived under repressive governments and had much lower living standards than Western Europeans. And this created constant instability, because the populations in these countries didn't want to be part of the Soviet system, and this required the USSR to maintain military forces throughout Eastern Europe to prevent rebellions and uprisings. And the costs of this occupation were enormous, because the Soviets had to station hundreds of thousands of troops outside their borders and subsidize Eastern European economies to prevent total collapse and provide economic aid that they couldn't really afford. And here's the strategic impact, because while American allies contributed to Western military and economic strength, Soviet allies were actually a drain on Soviet resources. And the Warsaw Pact looked impressive on paper, but in reality most of those forces were unreliable, because the soldiers came from countries that resented Soviet domination, and this meant the USSR couldn't actually trust most of its alliance structure in a real conflict. And the contrast was visible whenever someone had a choice, because people fled from east to west, never the other direction. And East Germany had to build a wall to keep its population from escaping, and over 3 million people left before the wall went up in 1961. And this demonstrated that when people could choose, they chose the American system, and this created a propaganda disaster for the Soviets, because they claimed their system was superior but had to use force to prevent people from leaving. And the third reason was purely geographic, but had massive strategic implications, and that's American control of the world's oceans, which allowed the United States to project power globally and maintain supply lines to allies, while the Soviet Union was largely a land power that couldn't sustain forces far from its borders. And here's how this worked. Because the United States Navy was larger and more technologically advanced than all other navies combined, and by the 1980s the US had 15 aircraft carrier battle groups that could operate anywhere in the world, and these carriers could strike targets thousands of miles inland and could be resupplied at sea indefinitely. And this meant that American military power could reach any coastal region on Earth, and over 70% of the world's population lives within 200 miles of a coast. And the Soviet Navy tried to compete, but never came close, because aircraft carriers required decades of experience to operate effectively, and the Soviets only built a few smaller carriers that were much less capable. And more importantly, the Soviet Union was geographically constrained, because their major naval bases were either in the Arctic, which freezes, or the Baltic, which is easily blocked, or the Black Sea, which requires passage through Turkish Straits, or the Pacific, which is far from the European theater. And this meant Soviet naval forces could be bottled up relatively easily, while American ships could move freely between oceans, and this created an asymmetric situation where the US could threaten Soviet interests globally, while the Soviets could only project power in areas adjacent to their borders. And the practical impact was enormous, because American allies in Europe and Asia could receive reinforcements and supplies by sea, and the US could guarantee the safety of global shipping lanes, which facilitated international trade. And this allowed the Western economic system to become truly global, while the Soviet bloc remained largely isolated. And here's why this mattered strategically, because control of the seas meant control of global commerce and resources, and the United States could access Middle Eastern oil and Asian manufacturing and European markets, while the Soviet Union was dependent on internal resources and the few allies it could reach by land. And the fourth reason is the one that actually destroyed the Soviet Union. And it's the arms race that America deliberately accelerated in the 1980s, knowing the Soviets would try to keep pace, and this would bankrupt their economy. And the mechanism here is brilliant in its simplicity, because the United States had an economy that was 6 times larger than the Soviet economy, and was based on consumer goods and services that generated constant growth, while the Soviet economy was rigid and centrally planned and already struggling. And when President Reagan announced massive increases in defense spending, including the Strategic Defense Initiative to develop space-based missile defense, the Soviets faced an impossible choice. And here's why this was a trap. Because if they didn't try to match American spending, they would fall behind militarily and potentially face a situation where the U.S. had decisive advantages. But if they did try to match the spending, they would devastate their civilian economy. And the Soviets chose to compete. And this decision was fatal, because they were already spending an estimated 40% of GDP on defense, compared to about 6% for the United States. And increasing that spending even further meant cannibalizing the civilian economy, and this created shortages of consumer goods and stagnation in living standards and growing public discontent. And think about the mathematics, because if America increased defense spending by $100 billion, that represented about 2% of a $5 trillion economy. But if the Soviets tried to match that in real terms, it might represent 10% of their much smaller economy, and they simply couldn't sustain that. And the Strategic Defense Initiative was particularly clever because it required advanced technologies in areas like computer systems and sensors and space-based platforms. And these were exactly the areas where American consumer markets had driven innovation, and where Soviet technology was furthest behind. And Soviet scientists knew they couldn't match SDI capabilities without enormous investments in basic research and development. And here's what made this decisive, because by the mid-1980s, the Soviet economy was collapsing under the strain, and economic growth had stopped and shortages were widespread, and the government was running massive deficits, and the military spending that was supposed to protect the system was actually destroying it. And when Mikhail Gorbachev became Soviet leader in 1985, he recognized that the arms race was unsustainable, and he tried to reform the economy through perestroika and glasnost. But these reforms actually accelerated the collapse, because once you allow criticism of the system, people realize how badly it's failing. And once you try to introduce market mechanisms into a command economy, the whole structure falls apart. And by 1989, the Eastern European satellites were breaking away. And by 1991, the Soviet Union itself dissolved, and the arms race was the primary cause, because it exposed the fundamental weakness of the Soviet economic model. And the fifth reason is something that operated at the cultural level, but had profound strategic effects. And that's American soft power through media and entertainment and consumer culture, which made the Western lifestyle attractive to people living under communism, and eroded the ideological foundations of the Soviet system. And here's how this worked, because American movies and music and television shows reached audiences behind the Iron Curtain through various channels, and these showed a vision of life that was dramatically different from Soviet propaganda. And people in Moscow and Warsaw and Budapest could see that ordinary Americans lived in large houses and owned cars and had access to abundant consumer goods and could travel freely. And this created what's called cognitive dissonance, because Soviet propaganda claimed that capitalism exploited workers and created poverty, while socialism provided for everyone's needs. But people could see with their own eyes that Americans had higher living standards and more freedom, and this undermined belief in the communist system, and the impact was particularly strong among young people who were exposed to Western music and fashion and ideas, and they could see that Western culture was dynamic and innovative and fun, while Soviet culture was rigid and controlled and boring. And this created generational pressure for change. And the Soviet government tried to stop this through censorship and jamming radio broadcasts and restricting travel. But information always found a way through. And by the 1980s, people throughout the Soviet bloc understood that they were living in a failing system. And this knowledge was corrosive, because it meant that fewer people believed in communist ideology, and more people wanted access to Western goods and freedoms. And when the system finally collapsed, very few people defended it, because they had stopped believing in it years earlier. And American soft power had done what military power couldn't, because it had convinced people that the Western system was superior. And the sixth reason ties everything together, and it's the American strategy of containment that prevented Soviet expansion while waiting for internal contradictions to destroy the system. And this strategy was articulated by George Kennan in 1947, and it guided American policy for 4 decades. And here's why containment was brilliant: because it recognized that the Soviet system had fundamental weaknesses and would eventually collapse if prevented from expanding. And the American approach was to resist Soviet expansion wherever it occurred through a combination of military alliances and economic aid, and covert action, and occasionally direct military intervention. And this meant that the Soviets couldn't break out of their geographic constraints, or access new resources, or expand their economic base. And meanwhile, the contradictions within the Soviet system kept getting worse because the command economy was inefficient, and technological development was slow, and the empire was expensive to maintain, and consumer expectations were rising, and eventually something had to break, and containment ensured that when the break came, it happened within Soviet borders rather than allowing the USSR to solve its problems through external expansion. And think about how this played out, because every time the Soviets tried to expand, they faced American resistance. And in Greece and Turkey in the late 1940s, the US provided aid to prevent communist takeovers, and in Korea, the US fought to prevent communist unification of the peninsula, and in Vietnam, the US intervened to prevent North Vietnamese conquest of the South, and in Afghanistan, the US armed the Mujahideen, who made Soviet occupation impossibly costly. And each of these conflicts drained Soviet resources and demonstrated that expansion was difficult and expensive. And this created a strategic situation where the USSR was locked into a competition. It couldn't win because it couldn't expand to gain new resources, and couldn't reform without undermining the system, and couldn't keep pace with American technology, and couldn't maintain its empire without enormous costs. And here's the ultimate impact, because when you combine all 6 of these reasons, you see a systematic destruction of Soviet power that was deliberate and methodical and effective, because the economic model advantage meant the US had innovation and growth that the USSR couldn't match, and the alliance structure meant America had partners contributing resources, while Soviet allies drained resources, and the naval dominance meant the US controlled global commerce while the USSR was isolated, and the arms race bankrupted the Soviet economy by forcing unsustainable military spending, and American soft power eroded belief in communism among Soviet citizens, and containment prevented the USSR from escaping these pressures through expansion. And the cumulative effect was a system that looked powerful in 1945, but was actually doomed because every element of American strategy was designed to exploit Soviet weaknesses. And by 1991, the Soviet Union had lost the Cold War so completely that it ceased to exist, and this victory was achieved without direct military conflict between the superpowers, which makes it one of the most successful strategic campaigns in history, because the United States identified the enemy's vulnerabilities and systematically attacked them over decades until the entire Soviet system collapsed. And the lesson is that military power alone doesn't determine outcomes, because the USSR had enormous military forces, but they couldn't compensate for economic weakness and technological backwardness and alliance problems and geographic constraints and ideological erosion and strategic encirclement. And when all 6 of these factors worked together, the result was inevitable, and the Soviet Union didn't just lose the Cold War, it completely disintegrated, and the United States emerged as the sole superpower. And this outcome was the result of deliberate American strategy executed consistently over 4 decades, and it represents one of the greatest strategic victories in human history.